plantation owner married his fat cook slave as a bet. What happened shocked the South. The document still sleeps in the Louisiana State Archives, its paper stained the color of old bone, its ink fading like a confession whispered too late. It records a union that should never have existed, binding Jeremiah Aldrich to Celeste, identified not as a woman, but as an object, catalogued beneath his name like furniture or land. Yet the horror of that certificate does not rest solely in the forced marriage between a plantation master and his enslaved cook. It lies in what followed. 13 lives extinguished in the humid months after their vows were spoken, deaths so unsettling that even a society built on cruelty recoiled in silence. Newspapers of the era hinted at a plot too vile to expose fully, and powerful families ensured the truth was pressed deep into the mud of the Delta. What emerged instead was a legend of vengeance, calculated suffering, and a punishment that unfolded slowly, deliberately, and without mercy. Before the marriage, before Willowbrook Plantation became synonymous with whispers and fear, the roots of this nightmare stretched backward into an earlier decade, into a time when reputation mattered more than conscience and betrayal was answered not with words but with ruin. This story begins in the Mississippi Delta, where ambition thrived in darkness and fortunes were shaped from human agony. Jeremiah Aldrich arrived there as an outsider, a man with no lineage to shield him. Born to a broken farmer in Kentucky, he came south carrying nothing but hunger for power and a willingness to touch the filth others pretended did not exist. In New Orleans, he learned quickly that slavery was not merely a system, but an economy layered with hypocrisy. Old families spoke proudly of cotton and sugar, while quietly benefiting from bodies bought and sold like livestock. Aldrich saw opportunity where others saw discomfort. He allied himself with 2 men equally desperate. Marcus Devo, heir to a collapsing sugar dynasty, needed cash to stop creditors from devouring his inheritance. Samuel Rochelle, once a river captain, had survived fever, loss, and disgrace, but retained knowledge of forbidden routes that still ferried stolen souls from distant shores. Together they built an enterprise that thrived in the shadows, a trading operation that specialized in those no one would miss. They did not ask where their captives came from. Escaped laborers recaptured through bribery. Free black citizens dragged into chains by corrupt hunters. Men and women smuggled through hidden channels long after the law claimed such voyages were over. Profit poured in because compassion cost money, and they spent none. For years, their wealth multiplied, and with it their confidence. Respectability was purchased easily. Devo restored his family's plantation and wore pride like armor. Rochelle became a respected shipping magnate, his past erased by success. Aldrich crowned himself with Willowbrook Plantation, its white columns declaring his arrival among the elite, though every brick was mortared with suffering. But prosperity dulls caution. Rumors surfaced of federal scrutiny, of marshals tracing illegal routes, of former captives speaking names that should have remained buried. Panic crept into their meetings, held in Aldrich's grand study, surrounded by books he never read and portraits of ancestors who were not his. Each man understood the same truth. If exposed, none would survive intact. Devo begged to dissolve everything, to burn records and vanish. Rochelle argued for patience, for hiding assets and waiting out the storm. Aldrich listened in silence, his expression calm, his mind already settled on something far worse. He chose betrayal as salvation. His plan was simple in its cruelty. Remove the other two, frame the scene as a mutual slaughter born of greed, and emerge as the sole witness to a tragic dispute. Wealth would be consolidated. Evidence would disappear. Guilt would be absorbed by the dead. It was a solution stripped of hesitation, conceived with the icy precision of a man who no longer saw others as human. What Aldrich failed to understand was that evil rarely ends where it begins. The murders he arranged unleashed consequences that would coil back toward him, patient and methodical. Willowbrook Plantation, meant to be his sanctuary, became the stage for his undoing. Celeste, the cook he later forced into marriage as part of a wager meant to humiliate and entertain his peers, was not the silent, broken figure he believed her to be. She had listened. She had watched. She carried memories sharper than knives. After the wedding, death returned to Willowbrook again and again, slipping through corridors and cabins alike. Illnesses appeared suddenly. Accidents multiplied. Men collapsed with faces twisted in terror, as though they had seen something waiting just beyond sight. Each loss was dismissed, explained away, or quietly buried. But 13 times the soil was disturbed, and 13 times the plantation grew heavier with dread. Aldrich felt it in the walls, in the way shadows lingered too long, in the sound of footsteps when no one was there. By the time he realized that his past had not been erased but merely transformed, it was too late. The system he had fed now consumed him. The marriage certificate remained, a brittle witness to arrogance and cruelty, while the truth rotted beneath polite society's silence. In the end, Willowbrook did not remember Aldrich as a gentleman planter. It remembered him as a warning. And if you listen closely, Gospel of the Haunted still hears the echoes of that warning, carried on the night air, reminding us that some sins do not fade. They wait. The humid air clung to every surface of the abandoned warehouse that night, thick with the scent of oil, rotting wood, and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. June 1843 had arrived with a sweltering heat that seemed to pulse with intention, as if the very city of New Orleans conspired to watch a darkness unfold. Jeremiah Aldrich had orchestrated this meeting with a meticulous, almost surgical precision. He claimed it was to discuss their departure from the illicit trade that had lined their pockets and stained their hands. But in truth, the evening was the execution of a plan conceived in the coldest recesses of his mind. The warehouse, set for demolition with the city's expansion of its bustling port, was abandoned after sunset, a ghostly theater perfectly suited for murder. Aldrich arrived early, his heart steady beneath the tailored coat that hid a loaded pistol, a boot concealing a skinning knife sharpened to a cruel perfection. The scheme was simple, if monstrous: strike Devo first, stage a fight with Rochelle that would leave both men dead, and paint himself as a survivor, an innocent bystander, caught in the crossfire of ambition and greed. False witnesses were in place, 3 laborers from the docks, ready to swear that the partners had quarreled violently over missing money, cementing the illusion of chaos rather than premeditation. When Devo and Rochelle entered, the scene appeared ordinary. Aldrich sat at their customary planning table, a bottle of rare whiskey open, 3 glasses ready, ledgers and shipping documents stacked in neat, distracting towers. Devo spoke first, rehearsing the threats they faced from law and creditors, while Rochelle outlined a plan to safeguard their assets, ferrying them out of American reach to Havana. The conversation flowed with familiarity, until Aldrich began subtly pivoting it toward the hidden stores of wealth. His tone light but probing, asking for account numbers, locations, details that should have never been shared. The seasoned sailor, Rochelle, recognized the shift immediately, the slight coldness in Aldrich's gaze, the hand that lingered near the pistol, the controlled tension in his words. Instinct screamed danger when Rochelle proposed postponing the discussion and reconvening with legal counsel. Aldrich understood that time was slipping away. In a flash, violence erupted. A gunshot cracked through the warehouse like a clap of thunder, and Devo fell, chest torn by the bullet, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief, shock, and the unmistakable betrayal of a man who had trusted the wrong friend. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glistening, staining the floorboards and their plans alike. Rochelle, caught unprepared but not broken, countered with fury. He overturned the table, scattering ledgers like autumn leaves, and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slicing a line across Aldrich's cheek that would serve as a permanent testament to that night. The struggle that followed was brutal, a 10-minute war waged between desperation and ruthless intent. Crates toppled, papers fluttered in the humid air, and every surface became marked with blood as the men grappled over the gleaming steel of the boot knife. The older sailor fought with a knowledge born of danger, refusing the death Aldrich sought to impose quietly. Yet age, inexorable and cruel, began to weigh against him. Aldrich drove the knife deep, twisting it upward in a motion meant to guarantee silence. Rochelle's hands clawed at the blade, his breaths ragged, yet even in his final moments, words slipped from his lips, hissing through pain like a curse. "My son knows everything. He will make you pay when he is ready." Aldrich dismissed the threat then, believing it the delirium of a dying man. He had no inkling that Phip, Marcus Devo's younger brother, had been quietly observing, noting every transaction, every deception, while Rochelle's 17-year-old son Henry knew the intricate details of their operations as intimately as any captain knows the tides. Knowledge, Aldrich would soon discover, is a weapon sharper than any knife. With Rochelle and Devo dead, Aldrich turned to the grim work of staging the scene, hours of careful positioning to weave a narrative of chaos and self-defense. Devo's body was posed to suggest a desperate reach for a weapon, Rochelle's wounds and knife positioned to tell a story of mutual violence. Money scattered, ledgers torn, a safe left smashed as though greed had been the true murderer. Even Aldrich's own hands bore wounds, shallow but convincing, to cement his role as the reluctant survivor. The witnesses performed as rehearsed, describing heated arguments over partnership funds, corroborating the tale Aldrich wanted the authorities to believe. When the New Orleans police arrived, weary of the city's usual crimes and reluctant to investigate the violent death of 3 men whose faces and families carried weight. They accepted his story. Their report concluded that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other in a dispute over money, Aldrich barely escaping with his life. Justice, if it could be called that, was a lie sealed with ink and perfunctory signatures. Yet the warehouse still retained the echoes of struggle, the lingering smell of gunpowder and iron, as if the walls themselves remembered the betrayal and violence, whispering secrets to anyone willing to listen. Willowbrook Plantation, later, would not remember Aldrich as a man of respect or power. It remembered him as a warning, a shadow of greed and cruelty that could not be erased. And if you strain your ears, gospel of the haunted still hears the murmurs from that humid June night, carried on the wind, where betrayal and blood mingle forever, reminding us that some sins do not fade, they watch, they wait, and one day they come for you. Within a week, the warehouse was nothing more than splintered beams and dust, the echoes of human greed and violence buried beneath the relentless march of progress. Every trace of the Delta Trading Company's illicit dealings vanished into memory and rubble, leaving Aldrich with a fortune suddenly unclaimed, ready for him to seize. He moved quickly, presenting himself as the sole survivor of a legitimate shipping enterprise, wielding forged documents that suggested Devo and Rochelle had consented, in writing, to transfer their shares to him in the event of their deaths. Banks, wary of 3 unknown men funneling vast sums, were eager to accept the word of a single plantation owner, whose history of cotton production offered the illusion of respectability. Over the following months, Aldrich emptied every account, every hidden cache, every lockbox and secret deposit his partners had maintained. He estimated the total wealth at a staggering sum, enough to cement his position among Louisiana's elite and erase the memory of those he had murdered. More than money, though, it was freedom from consequence, or so he believed. In his obsession with immediate gain, he had neglected the quiet shadows that waited beyond his vision. The families of the men he had killed. He had not considered that vengeance often comes on the wings of patience, nurtured by careful minds who measure time differently than the reckless or the greedy. Philip Devo was 22, young but unnervingly calculating, his mind honed by necessity and circumstance. Where his elders had acted with impulsive cruelty, he measured every movement, every piece of information, every whisper of rumor, storing it like ammunition. He had meticulously maintained records of every transaction the Delta Trading Company had undertaken, coded ledgers, tracking enslaved souls, shipping manifests for illegal Caribbean routes, and correspondences with the corrupt officials who had enabled the enterprise. And he had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. There had always been something too eager, too cold, too gleaming in the newcomer's ambition, a hunger that spoke not of necessity, but of a crueler appetite. When news of Marcus's violent death reached the Devo plantation, Philip's mind did not flare with grief. It ignited with calculation. He recognized instantly that the official story made no sense. His brother, cautious by nature even in desperation, would never have confronted Rochelle in violence. Samuel Rochelle, a man shaped by years of the sea and negotiation, resolved disputes with words and numbers, not knives. And Aldrich's account contained subtle impossibilities, details only someone unfamiliar with the truth could assert. References to funds moved weeks earlier, events that could not have occurred as described. Philip began quietly, invisibly. He reached into the network his brother had cultivated over years: dock workers, clerks, minor officials whose loyalty could be bribed, records that had been overlooked, misfiled, or deliberately altered. Layer by layer, the illusion Aldrich had constructed unraveled. It became clear that the murders had been staged, that witnesses had been bought, and that Aldrich had moved swiftly to seize the assets of the men whose lives he had destroyed. Every discovery stoked Philip's resolve, sharpening it into something cold, inexorable, and frighteningly patient. Meanwhile, Henry Rochelle pursued a parallel path, approaching the problem from a different angle. At 24, he combined maritime experience inherited from his father with formal training in law and finance, a dangerous combination that made him uniquely capable of tracing not only the stolen wealth, but the mechanisms by which Aldrich had executed his crimes. Over months, he pieced together transactions, transfers, and manipulations, revealing that the plantation owner had systematically plundered over $60,000 in cash, property, and investments. The scale of the theft was enormous, built upon the suffering of countless enslaved individuals, yet Henry's understanding went beyond simple accounting. He recognized that Aldrich's hubris, the very greed that had propelled him to murder, was a weakness that could be exploited. Instead of rushing to confront the murderer directly, Henry developed a plan to use Aldrich's own appetite against him to slowly dismantle his fortune and make him vulnerable to the same kind of betrayal and ruin he had inflicted on others. Every bank, every transaction, every shadowed record could become a weapon. And so the two young men, Philip and Henry, moved like predators in a quiet forest, each pursuing their own evidence, each building a trap from patience, intellect, and the promise of long-delayed justice. Their first meeting occurred in the fall of 1844, over a year after the murders, in a small, discreet restaurant tucked away in the French Quarter, far from prying eyes. The air between them was taut with mutual recognition of purpose. Each had lost a father or brother to Aldrich's cruelty. Each possessed knowledge and skill that complemented the other. As they spoke, plans took shape, quiet at first, then with growing intensity, a scheme that would allow them to turn Aldrich's fortune, his reputation, and his confidence against him. They understood, instinctively, that vengeance need not be immediate to be devastating. Sometimes the most horrifying retribution is the one that creeps slowly, unnoticed, until it is too late to escape. And in the shadows of New Orleans, where the humid air carried the memory of gunfire, blood, and betrayal, the story of Jeremiah Aldrich, once a master of greed and violence, was about to enter a new chapter. One in which the sins he had thought buried with his victims would rise again, patient and relentless, whispering through the streets, the docks, and the ledgers, promising that some debts are never forgotten. The vengeance plotted by Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle was not born of rash fury, but of calculated patience, a slow, inexorable web designed to crush Jeremiah Aldrich in the same way he had destroyed their families. Each man brought his own skills, his own unique access to information and power, and together they became a force Aldrich could never anticipate. By the spring of 1845, their individual quests for justice had merged into a single, sophisticated strategy, a campaign of betrayal, financial subversion, and psychological torment that would bring Aldrich to his knees without a single immediate shot fired. Their plan was subtle, elegant in its cruelty, the antithesis of the impulsive brutality Aldrich had wielded so freely. The first step was observation, infiltration. Philip, moving through the corridors of Louisiana, high society, with the charm and poise inherited from his late brother, positioned himself among the very circles Aldrich sought to impress. Gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, lavish social event, every interaction became a study of Aldrich's habits, his pride, his vulnerabilities. He did not seek confrontation, he sought knowledge. Slowly, invisibly, he became a familiar figure in Aldrich's periphery, someone trusted enough to share a drink, laugh at a joke, yet insignificant enough to escape suspicion. Every smile, every nod, every casual conversation was a thread in the intricate net they were weaving. Meanwhile, Henry Rochelle probed the foundations of Aldrich's wealth with the precision of a master strategist. He discovered a financial empire built on risky investments, leveraged loans, and ventures that promised short-term gain but invited long-term collapse. Most damning of all, he uncovered Aldrich's dangerous indulgence in gambling, high-stakes poker, horse racing bets, all funded by loans that bled the plantation dry and tied his future harvests to the whims of chance. Henry recognized the opening immediately. Greed, combined with hubris, created a vulnerability they could exploit without raising suspicion. By 1848, Henry had secured employment at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution that held the mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this vantage, he began to subtly manipulate Aldrich's financial obligations. Loan renewals came with incremental increases in interest. Payment schedules were timed to create critical cash shortages during planting season. Each decision nudged Aldrich closer to desperation, each month tightening the invisible noose around his fortune. Meanwhile, Philip turned his attention to the shadows of the city's gambling underworld. Through careful bribery and strategic favors, he arranged for Aldrich to attend increasingly high-stakes games, surrounded by opponents secretly aligned against him. Every hand dealt, every bet placed, ensured that Aldrich lost more than he could bear, deepening his dependence, inflating his stress, and weakening his carefully cultivated facade of control. Their genius lay in patience and precision. Aldrich was not confronted with threats or immediate danger. Instead, he was suffocated slowly, financially, psychologically, until the pillars of his world, the wealth, the respect, the power he had seized through murder, crumbled beneath him. By 1851, the strain was evident. Debts mounted to terrifying heights, interest payments consumed the plantation's profits, and whispers of financial instability spread through the Louisiana elite. Aldrich, once confident and commanding, became paranoid, erratic, and increasingly desperate. searching for solutions that did not exist, trusting none and fearing everything. But wealth alone was not sufficient. Philip and Henry understood that true retribution demanded humiliation, terror, and the intimate awareness of consequences. They wanted Aldrich to comprehend, fully and completely, that his status, his respectability, his life, had been built upon blood and cruelty, and that justice, slow, deliberate, and inevitable, had finally arrived. The final phase of their revenge required more than financial manipulation. It demanded control over every aspect of his world, forcing Aldrich to a point where he would have no choice but to accept their terms, no matter how degrading, dangerous, or psychologically tormenting. He had to be trapped, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. Henry, with his legal acumen and deep understanding of human psychology, conceived a particularly ingenious instrument for their plan: Aldrich's own enslaved people. Plantation owners lived in constant fear of rebellion, a terror that could be exploited without ever inciting actual insurrection. Henry proposed subtle manipulations, suggestions, orchestrated rumors, small but unnerving disturbances, enough to unsettle Aldrich's mind and feed his growing paranoia. Philip's social access and knowledge of Aldrich's habits allowed them to exploit this fear in carefully calculated increments, ensuring that the plantation owner felt haunted, scrutinized, and increasingly powerless, while never fully understanding the source of his mounting dread. It was a psychological siege, invisible yet inescapable, an assault that leveraged every aspect of Aldrich's life against him: his social standing, his finances, his health, and his own mounting terror. Every meeting, every gamble, every ledger entry became a weapon in a war he could neither see nor resist. By the time Philip and Henry moved toward their final phase, Aldrich was already enmeshed in a network of failures of his own making, a man eroded by the very traits that had once elevated him above law, morality, and fear. And through it all, the specter of the murdered Devo and Rochelle families lingered, invisible yet omnipresent, guiding the hands of those who sought justice. Every subtle misstep, every weakening of resolve, every sleepless night under the humid Louisiana sky reminded Aldrich that some sins, no matter how cleverly buried, do not remain hidden. They wait, they whisper, and when the time comes, they ensure that no crime against family, no act of cruelty, no betrayal ever goes unanswered. The choice of Celeste was never accidental. From the beginning, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle understood that true destruction required precision, not chaos, and humiliation, not spectacle. They studied Willowbrook Plantation the way surgeons study a body, before the knife ever touches skin. Every face, every routine, every quiet resentment was examined for its potential to wound Jeremiah Aldrich where he believed himself untouchable. And again, their attention returned to the same figure, moving silently through the kitchens, heavy steps echoing softly against stone floors, eyes lowered but burning with something far more dangerous than obedience. Celeste was approaching her 40th year, a large woman by any measure, but her size meant nothing to the men planning Aldrich's end. What mattered was her mind, sharp and unclouded by illusion, her memory, long and exact, and the hatred she carried like a living thing inside her chest. She did not fear Aldrich. She despised him. Where others learned to survive by hiding their thoughts behind practiced submission, Celeste had never fully learned that art. She worked efficiently, spoke when spoken to, and did not openly rebel, yet her eyes never softened in his presence. Anyone who watched closely could feel the tension in the room when he entered, a cold, unspoken promise that something was waiting. Her hatred had been forged years earlier, when Aldrich purchased her from a collapsing plantation along the Mississippi. She had not been alone then. She had belonged to a family, a husband, children. When the sale came, Aldrich chose only her. He could have afforded the others. He simply did not want them. When she begged him to buy at least her youngest child, her voice breaking in front of strangers, he laughed, dismissing her grief as inconvenience. From that moment forward, something in Celeste hardened beyond repair. For years she cooked his meals, rich stews, delicate sauces, lavish spreads for guests who praised Aldrich's taste and refinement. She served him food while surviving on scraps, listening to him boast of prosperity built on blood and theft. She cleaned his clothes when they were stained from nights. He never explained. She watched papers curl into ash in the fireplace as his confidence began to rot into paranoia. And all the while, she learned. She memorized his habits, the times he ate, the medicines he swallowed for his ruined stomach, the rooms he favored when anxious, the nights he could not sleep. Knowledge gathered slowly, quietly, like poison steeping in water. This was what made her invaluable. Philip and Henry knew better than to approach her directly. Any visible contact would have raised suspicion, possibly sealed her fate before their plan ever matured. Instead, they moved through shadows, using free people of color who traveled between markets and plantations, faces Aldrich would not question. At first, the exchanges were small, a coin, a question, a detail about Aldrich's routines. What came back to them was more than they dared hope for. Celeste was not merely observant. She was already fighting her own private war. She had been ruining him in ways too subtle to accuse, adding just enough salt to inflame his illness, allowing favorite objects to break through carefully staged accidents, letting whispers spread among the enslaved about debts and looming sales. Nothing provable, nothing direct, just enough to keep him restless, irritable, and afraid. When Philip and Henry finally revealed who they were, when the truth of murdered brothers and fathers was spoken aloud, Celeste did not hesitate. Her answer was immediate. She would help them destroy him. She demanded only one thing in return: freedom, and a chance to flee north, to a place where chains held no legal power, where she might someday find the children torn from her. Philip and Henry agreed without pause. In that moment, Celeste ceased to be a pawn. She became a partner. The final shape of their revenge emerged slowly, deliberately, over months of whispered coordination. Aldrich would be driven past desperation into terror. His gambling debts would swell. His loans would collapse. His options would narrow until only one remained. The offer would be simple and monstrous: a legal marriage to Celeste, presented as a solution to creditors circling like wolves. Accept the union and survive. Refuse it and face immediate destruction. The marriage would do what no accusation ever could. It would annihilate his reputation. A respected planter bound by law to an enslaved woman would become a joke, a scandal, a living disgrace. Worse still, it would place his household, his property, and ultimately his body under Celeste's control. The humiliation would be total. PBLIC, IR of RR CBLE. But humiliation was only the beginning. Once married, Celeste would no longer be merely his cook. She would be his wife, his caretaker, the woman responsible for his meals, his medicine, his health. Over time, his suffering would mirror the agony he had inflicted on others, slow, lingering, uncertain. A decline so gradual that no single moment could be blamed, no single hand accused. He would weaken day by day, haunted by the presence of the woman he had broken, now bound to him by law and vengeance. Yet even this required perfect timing. Too soon, and suspicion would bloom. Too late, and Aldrich might escape through some desperate gamble or unexpected windfall. Every move had to align. Every pressure applied, just enough to force compliance without revealing the trap. Philip handled the social currents. Henry manipulated the financial machinery, and Celeste waited, patient and unblinking, inside the house that had been her prison. By the time Aldrich sensed what was happening, it would already be too late. The walls would close in. The past would stand before him, not as memory, but as flesh and breath and law. And in that moment, when survival demanded submission, Jeremiah Aldrich would learn the final truth, whispered through Gospel of the Haunted. Some vengeance does not arrive with blades or bullets. Some vengeance waits, watches, learns. And when it comes, it does not kill quickly. It teaches. They had waited for the perfect moment, a time when Aldrich would be most vulnerable, alone, desperate, and far from any ally who might intervene. Henry Rochelle discovered it in early 1854, when whispers reached him that Aldrich planned to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, a last-ditch effort to salvage his plantation from foreclosure. The timing was flawless. A man teetering on the edge of ruin, surrounded by strangers, with every hope dangling on the turn of a card. It was the kind of desperation that makes one accept AM terms, no matter how humiliating, no matter how absolute. The gambling den was tucked away in a converted warehouse along the fog-choked waterfront, a place of shadows and smoke, where the city's desperate men risked their fortunes on flickering gaslight and whispered promises. That February evening, the mist from the Mississippi rolled thick and heavy, smothering the streets and muting every sound, twisting the ordinary into a nightmare landscape. Aldrich arrived carrying a leather satchel, almost every coin and note he had been able to scrape together from the sale of slaves, equipment, and trinkets from Willowbrook Plantation. $8,000, his final gamble, his last breath of hope. He did not yet realize that every hand, every bet, every shuffled deck had been arranged with care, orchestrated over months by Philip and Henry. Every other player at the table had been planted to ensure that Aldrich's downfall would be absolute. The game was 5-card stud, stakes climbing higher with each hand until the table itself became a pressure cooker of tension and greed. At first, fortune seemed to favor him. Small victories gave him courage, lent him a false sense of control. He told himself that luck had finally returned, that the plantation could be saved. But the longer he played, the more recklessness crept into his moves. His bets grew larger, more desperate, the alcohol loosening the constraints of reason. By midnight, he had already lost more than half of his remaining fortune. Yet he pressed on, feverish and frantic, convinced he could claw back what he had lost. The other players allowed him occasional triumphs, enough to keep him tethered to the table. But each small victory was a trap. Each hand pulled him deeper, closer to the abyss, until he risked everything on a single draw, unaware that the entire table was working in silent coordination against him. The final hand began after 2 in the morning, when the fog outside had thickened into an almost tangible presence, smothering the city in gray silence. The gaslight struggled to penetrate the warehouse windows, casting shadows that danced like specters across the felt-covered table. Aldrich's hand held promise, a pair of kings, the possibility of a full house if fortune granted him mercy. He pushed his remaining $3,000 into the center of the table, heart-pounding, a last frantic plea to fate, but fortune had already abandoned him. The other players revealed stronger hands, each bet calculated to crush him utterly, to leave him bankrupt and drowning in debts beyond recovery. A stranger, cold-eyed and unyielding, collected the final winnings with the detached precision of someone who had known this outcome from the beginning. Aldrich stared at the table, frozen, as the last hope of his life evaporated, leaving him stripped bare in a room that had suddenly grown impossibly silent. The other men departed, shadows swallowing them into the mist, leaving only the stranger seated across from him, studying Aldrich with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Moments stretched like eternity before a voice finally cut the thick air, smooth, accented, yet carrying a weight Aldrich could not place. "Mr. Aldrich," the man said, "we should discuss your obligations. The gentlemen who just left were not simply gamblers. They represent certain interests that have been patient. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." Then movement at the edge of the room drew his attention. From the shadows, Philip Devo stepped forward, illuminated by flickering gaslight, and the resemblance to his murdered brother was immediate, undeniable. Aldrich's blood froze, a cold wave surging through him as memories of Marcus Devo's final agonized moments, betrayal, fear, a bullet in the chest, flashed like fire across his mind. Philip's eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto him. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philip said, gliding closer, voice low but razor-sharp, each word deliberate. "Perhaps you have. My name is Philip Devo. I believe you were well acquainted with my older brother Marcus. Were you not? In fact, you were the last person to see him alive. Were you not?" The warehouse seemed to shift, the humid air thick with a sudden chill, carrying the weight of every wrong, every betrayal, every life Aldrich had destroyed. His hands shook, sweat beading on his forehead, and for the first time in years, he understood the full measure of his peril. There were no debts he could bribe away, no alliances he could summon, no clever lies to untangle the trap that had finally closed around him. Every card lost, every loan defaulted. Every gamble made in desperation had been a thread leading him to this moment, and in that moment, every shadow in the warehouse seemed alive, every flicker of gaslight a witness. The quiet intensity of Philip, the cold precision of Henry's planning, and the unseen presence of Celeste, waiting to fulfill the final act, converged like a storm. Aldrich realized, with a shudder that shook his bones, that some vengeance does not come fast, does not demand a bullet or a blade. Some vengeance waits, watches, learns, and when it arrives, it does not kill quickly. It teaches. Every loss, every humiliation, every moment of fear was a lesson carved into his soul, a reckoning for the lives he had shattered. And as Philip stepped fully into the dim light, Aldrich understood that at last justice, slow, methodical, and inevitable, had come for him. The past he thought buried with his victims had risen again, patient and relentless, whispering through the fog, the tables, the ledgers, and the shadows, promising that no crime, no betrayal, no act of cruelty would ever remain unpaid. This was never a mere gamble. It was never a chance to save Willowbrook Plantation or to reclaim a shred of lost dignity. Every card dealt, every die rolled, every whispered bet had been meticulously orchestrated over more than a decade, a trap born of patience, precision, and unyielding hatred. Henry Rochelle emerged from the shadows of the warehouse, completing the triangle of judgment that now surrounded Aldrich at the poker table. His presence was quiet, almost ceremonial, but it carried the weight of years of watching, waiting, and planning. "My father, Samuel, always said," Henry began, voice calm, deliberate. "You were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder two men and steal their lives, yet not clever enough to reckon with the fact that dead men sometimes leave behind sons. Sons who remember every story, every lesson, and never forget their father's killers." Aldrich sat frozen, the oppressive heat of the February night doing little to pierce the chill creeping down his spine. Outside, the river fog rolled in dense, smothering, turning New Orleans into a blur of gray and shadow. Inside, he was alone, trapped between two men who had spent years sculpting this moment with the artistry of malice. Every possible escape vanished before him, swallowed by the knowledge that his ruin was absolute, that even vanishing into the swamps would bring no salvation. Philip Devo moved deliberately to the chair across from Aldrich, settling as if the world itself had bent to his will. "We know everything, Jeremiah," he said, each word a blade of ice. "Everything about the Delta Trading Company, your illegal dealings, the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the meticulous theft of everything they built. And most importantly, we know that for 11 years, you've lived on blood money, constructing a life of comfort atop their corpses." Henry approached from the other side, producing a leather folder and spreading its contents across the table like a grim mosaic. Documents, bank ledgers, property transfers, correspondence with corrupt officials, evidence that left no room for doubt. Aldrich recognized some immediately: papers he had thought destroyed, records only obtainable through careful investigation, and, perhaps, a hint of bribery. Witness statements, sworn and verified, now spoke from the shadows of the past, implicating him with a precision that made every heartbeat thunder in his chest. The files were overwhelming. Each page a testament to his crimes, each ledger a monument to his arrogance. Philip and Henry, had not merely uncovered the past, they had built a living, breathing indictment, one that could topple not only Aldrich, but anyone in Louisiana society who had unwittingly aided him. The power of their patience was suffocating, and for the first time, Aldrich understood the scope of the reckoning before him. Philip leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Aldrich's. "The question is simple," he said. "What shall be done with this information? We could deliver it to federal authorities. You would face trial, and so would everyone complicit in laundering your stolen fortune. Or we could ensure that every person in New Orleans who has trusted you, done business with you, or respected you learns the truth about the life you've built on murder and theft. Either choice guarantees unpleasantness." Aldrich's voice broke through the silence, trembling. What do you want?" "Money. I can get money." "The plantation," Henry interrupted with the slow precision of a predator closing in on prey. "Your plantation is worthless. We hold the mortgage along with nearly all your debts. Every loan, every gamble, every scheme you relied upon to stay afloat now belongs to us. You have nothing left. Not a single asset, not a shred of influence. Your life is at our discretion." The gravity of those words sank into Aldrich, and with it, the realization that he was utterly exposed. Every comfort he had enjoyed, every veneer of respectability he had constructed, had been stripped away by the very sons of the men he had murdered. Death might still have been a choice, but even that had become contingent on their design. Philippe's voice softened, almost mockingly considerate. "There is, however, one path that allows you to continue breathing, at least for a while. It requires a sacrifice of dignity, a public acknowledgement of your true nature, a submission so complete that it will humiliate you beyond measure." Henry's lips curved into a cold, deliberate smile. "You will marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, and permanently. You will stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wedded wife. You will live as her husband, sleep in her bed, and present yourself to the world as a man who has chosen to wed the very person he owns." Aldrich recoiled as if struck. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. The suggestion was grotesque, a violation so profound it shattered every expectation of what could be endured in antebellum Louisiana. Celeste, his cook, property, to be bound to her in every legal, social, and moral sense. The idea was a nightmare crafted from the darkest reaches of his own sins, made flesh by the vengeance of those who had waited so long to see him brought low. The warehouse, heavy with fog, and the distant moan of the Mississippi seemed to contract around him. Every shadow deepened. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every flicker of gaslight, whispered of the years of patient plotting that had led to this moment. Aldrich was cornered, humiliated, and exposed, forced to confront not only the magnitude of his crimes, but the methodical justice of those who had endured far longer, suffered far more, and now had the power to make him live every one of his sins in agonizing, unrelenting reality. And in that suffocating silence, with the past pressing down like a physical weight, Aldrich finally realized the truth. Some vengeance does not strike quickly, does not rely on blades or bullets. Some vengeance waits, watches, manipulates every fear, every weakness, every obsession until the moment of perfect reckoning arrives. And when it does not simply punish. It teaches. It breaks. It transforms life itself into a mirror of every crime, every betrayal, every act of cruelty ever committed. For Jeremiah Aldrich, the lesson was only just beginning. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved person was more than scandalous. It was annihilation incarnate. Social destruction so total, so public, that even death might have seemed a mercy in comparison. Aldrich's lips parted in a trembling whisper, barely audible over the distant foghorns, echoing across the Mississippi. "You're insane. No one, it's impossible. No preacher would." Philippe's voice cut through the humid night like steel glinting in gaslight. "We have already made the arrangements." Calm, unflinching, deliberate. A minister in Naccio Parish, deeply indebted to certain establishments, has agreed to perform a legal ceremony. Properly witnessed, fully documented. As for the courts, Louisiana law is unequivocal. Marriage contracts, once executed, are binding regardless of circumstance. You will be legally married to Celeste. Every right, every obligation will be yours. Henry leaned forward, eyes glittering with a cold, deliberate satisfaction. "The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that we give you a choice. Refuse, and face immediate consequences for your crimes. Consequences that would involve far more physical pain than your imagination dares to conjure, or accept temporary humiliation in exchange for survival, however degraded that survival may be." The warehouse fell silent again, thick with tension, heavy with the humid, misty air that seeped through the cracks of its wooden frame. Aldrich's mind raced, scrambling to calculate any possible escape. Death, at least, would be finite. Brief. It would spare him public disgrace, preserve some fragment of his reputation. His neighbors might remember him as a man unlucky in business, a gambler undone. But they would never know the full horror of the murders he had committed. Marriage to Celeste, on the other hand. The thought made his stomach knot with fear. His social identity, meticulously cultivated over years, would shatter completely. He would exist in the public eye as the man who had bound himself to the very person he had once treated as property. A spectacle of obedience and shame for all Louisiana society to witness. Years of humiliation awaited him, private torment that would gnaw at every corner of his mind. How long? He finally rasped, his voice barely a sound, broken with disbelief. "If I agree, how long will it last?" Philip and Henry exchanged a glance, a silent communication of satisfaction, anticipation, and the cruel precision of their plan. "For the rest of your natural life," Philip said. "Marriage is a sacred bond, Mr. Aldrich. Given your age and apparent health concerns, your life may not extend as long as you imagine. But the humiliation, the slow degradation, that will last until your final breath." The implication was immediate, visceral. They were offering no fleeting disgrace, no temporary torment followed by freedom. They were offering a prolonged, exquisite punishment, a psychological execution, executed over years, designed to strip every layer of pride, every shred of authority, leaving only a hollow man cowering beneath the weight of his own sins. The alternative, death in the fog, drenched warehouse, and a body cast into the Mississippi, now seemed almost merciful in comparison. Aldrich's throat tightened, words failing him as he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what was being offered, what was being demanded. Philip's voice, smooth and deliberate, filled the silence. "Think of it as an opportunity, Jeremiah. Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance punished with creativity." Henry produced a leather-bound document, sliding it across the table with the deliberate flourish of a master orchestrator, revealing the final act of a grand design. The contract lay there, impossibly simple and absolute. A legal binding that would force him to marry Celeste, present the union as voluntary, demonstrate Christian benevolence, and endure every public glance, whispered joke, and scandalous rumor that would inevitably follow. All the while, the truth of coercion remained invisible. The neighbors, the society, even the courts, would see only his choice, not the decades of patience, observation, and vengeance that had cornered him into it. Aldrich's hands trembled violently as he reached for the pen, the contract slippery in his grasp, almost a physical manifestation of the trap he could not escape. Every instinct screamed to reject it, to flee, to resist, but where could he go? The sons of the men he had murdered were everywhere, their patience and cunning unmatched. Every possible avenue of escape had been closed years in advance. "You will marry Celeste," Philip said again, voice low and deliberate, each word sinking into Aldrich's mind like a nail. "Live with her as husband and wife. Provide for her as you would any lawful spouse. In return, your creditors will hold off, and you may continue operations at Willowbrook under our supervision. We have planned this moment for over a decade, Mr. Aldrich. Over a decade, every detail meticulously calculated, every contingency anticipated, every weakness catalogued." Aldrich tried to imagine a loophole, a legal escape, a miracle that could spare him from this slow degradation. Fleeing to another state, appealing to authorities, challenging the marriage, but even as the thoughts flickered through his mind, he saw the satisfaction in Philip and Henry's eyes. It was not fear he saw there, not malice. It was the cold, absolute certainty of a plan executed flawlessly, of justice, patient, deliberate, and terrifying, finally coming for him. He signed, and in that instant, as ink met paper, Aldrich understood the full magnitude of his capture. The life he had constructed from murder, greed, and deceit was gone. His power, his respectability, every illusion of control, all surrendered to the patient, relentless vengeance of those who had waited, watched, and learned. Every sin, every betrayal, every cruel act of the past now returned, reflected in a future he could neither escape nor survive unscathed. For Jeremiah Aldrich, the lesson was only just beginning, and in that moment, gospel of the haunted whispers through the shadows of Willowbrook, vengeance is patient. It is meticulous. And when it arrives, it does not simply punish, it teaches, it transforms, it ensures that no crime, no betrayal, no act of cruelty ever remains unanswered, and they had anticipated every desperate thought that might flicker through Aldrich's mind, every possible escape route he might imagine. The contract, signed and sealed, lay in Philippe's hands. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," he said, a subtle edge of amusement undercutting the measured politeness. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. I trust you'll dress appropriately for such a momentous occasion." The morning of March 15th, 1854, dawned gray, heavy, and suffocating. Clouds hung low and oppressive, threatening rain, while the humid wind carried the fated scent of the nearby swamps through Willowbrook Plantation. Aldrich had not slept. Since returning from New Orleans, he had prowled his study like a trapped animal, eyes fixed on the marriage contract that represented the obliteration of everything he had labored for over 15 years in Louisiana. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and respect, now felt like a cage, every beam and floorboard a silent witness to his impending degradation. Celeste had been informed of the arrangement, of course, but only through intermediaries. When Aldrich approached her at breakfast, stammering through his excuses about financial duress and societal expectation, she listened with the patience of someone who had long anticipated this moment. Her calm acceptance struck him more profoundly than anger or resistance ever could. "Yes, Master Aldrich," she said softly. "I understand. I will prepare myself for the ceremony." Her words were a quiet hammer, driving home the realization that she had likely known, planned, or at least foreseen this moment long before he had been forced to agree. Every measured movement in the kitchen, every purposeful gesture as she prepared what would be their final shared meal in the roles of master and servant, reinforced the certainty that his tormentors had orchestrated every detail with terrifying precision. Throughout the day, neighbors and acquaintances arrived, drawn by carefully worded invitations sent in Aldrich's name. The gathering was presented as a remarkable act of Christian charity, a benevolent gesture elevating a faithful servant to the dignity of wife. Some guests expected absurdity, a grotesque joke, or perhaps the visible unraveling of a man driven insane by financial collapse. Instead, they encountered a meticulously arranged ceremony, complete with decorations, refreshments, and a nervous groom performing his role with desperate conviction. Aldrich had donned his finest clothes. Following Philip's instructions to the letter, he played the part of a man committed to spiritual duty and eccentric generosity, repeating, with enough feigned sincerity, that his actions were guided by religious conversion and moral obligation. Most guests accepted this explanation, dismissing the horror beneath the surface as mere eccentricity or misfortune. Celeste entered the ceremony with quiet dignity, wearing a simple, elegant gown provided for the occasion. At 38, her stature was imposing, but her composure radiated authority. Her poise unnerved even the skeptical observers. She smiled, accepted congratulations with grace, and referred to the day as the most important of my life. Her tone laced with subtle defiance and undeniable control. The minister from Nechito Parish conducted the ceremony with professional detachment, reading vows, requesting responses, and presiding over the proceedings as though they were ordinary, unremarkable rites. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the congregation shifted uneasily, yet no one dared challenge the legality or the voluntary nature of the union. Aldrich's voice trembled as he recited his vows, barely audible beyond the first row, while Celeste's responses were confident, unwavering, and chilling in their clarity. She promised to honor and obey her new husband, but the conviction in her voice revealed an unspoken power, an authority that Aldrich had never anticipated. The moment of consummation was almost unbearable. When instructed to kiss his bride, Aldrich's face drained of color. The familiar gesture, once a sign of control and dominance, became a grotesque prelude to his ultimate humiliation. Celeste steadied him with gentle precision, leaning forward to meet his lips for the briefest, calculated kiss that sealed their legal bond. Every heartbeat of that moment carried the weight of his defeat. As guests departed, whispering and shaking their heads at what they had witnessed, Aldrich remained behind, trapped in the once familiar spaces of Willowbrook. The house, once a monument to his success and societal integration, had transformed into an alien labyrinth of submission and terror. Celeste moved with measured authority, rearranging furniture, redirecting possessions, and asserting her newfound role as mistress. Each movement reinforced the new hierarchy, the silent proclamation that everything Aldrich had once controlled now belonged to her. When he attempted to protest, she fixed him with a look of cold precision, a lifetime of anger and loss simmering in her gaze. "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife. Partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" The simple words carried the weight of years of calculated vengeance. That night, as they lay in the same bed that had once been his private refuge, Aldrich felt the crushing sophistication of his torment. This was not a death that ended pain. It was a slow, deliberate annihilation of spirit, a living punishment that would strip him of autonomy, dignity, and social standing. Every glance from Celeste, every measured action, every subtle reminder of the contract he had signed would serve as a relentless testament to the patience, precision, and inevitability of vengeance. And in that moment, gospel of the haunted whispers through the shadows of Willowbrook, vengeance is patient. It is meticulous, and when it arrives, it does not simply punish. It teaches. It transforms. It ensures that no crime, no betrayal, no act of cruelty ever remains unanswered. Aldrich would come to learn that some punishments are not swift. They are slow, comprehensive, and inescapable, extending far beyond what any man can endure, reshaping life itself into a mirror, reflecting every act of sin, every betrayal, every horror committed in the name of greed. For Jeremiah Aldrich, the lesson had only just begun. Aldrich had been ensnared in a daily torment more subtle, more devastating than any he had imagined. Every glance, every word, every carefully measured gesture from Celeste reminded him of the sins that had built his life: blood, theft, betrayal. She moved through the house with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he had done and exactly what he deserved. Each meal she prepared, each polite smile, was a blade disguised as domesticity, a slow, burning proof of his complete powerlessness. The marriage was not an end point. It was the opening act of a punishment so intricate, so deliberate, that even the cold, shadowed warehouse where he had first faced Philippe and Henry now seemed merciful by comparison. The first month of this twisted domesticity passed under a cloak of deceptive normality. To neighbors and visitors, the union appeared functional, even respectable. Celeste managed the household staff with efficient authority, entertained the occasional guest with courteous composure and maintained the delicate social pretenses that allowed Aldrich to preserve the illusion of a dignified life. From the outside, the unlikely couple's marriage looked orderly, even conventional. But within the walls of Willowbrook, Aldrich began to perceive the invisible threads of his own unraveling. Subtle changes in daily routines began to gnaw at him. Coffee tasted bitter, subtly wrong despite being prepared in the same familiar manner. Evening meals, beautiful and meticulously presented, left him sluggish, faintly nauseated, with a creeping exhaustion that he could not explain. Headaches began to punctuate his mornings. Dizziness shadowed his afternoons. At first, he blamed stress, the crushing humiliation of his forced marriage, the inescapable dependence on Philip and Henry's mercy. But as days bled into weeks, the sickness persisted, growing more precise, more insidious, until he realized with a shiver that these were no random ailments. Confirmation came through Dr. Hamilton Warren, the long-serving physician of Willowbrook, who arrived one morning after Aldrich collapsed during a meeting with cotton buyers. The doctor's examination was cautious, professional, yet his words were a quiet sentence of doom. "Your condition is grave, Mr. Aldrich," he said, eyes serious beneath bushy brows. "The symptoms indicate prolonged exposure to toxic substances, arsenic or a similar metallic poison. The pattern is consistent with deliberate, cumulative administration. Left unchecked, this will destroy your digestive system, your nerves, and eventually your life. This is not accidental." The reality hit Aldrich with crushing clarity. Celeste, the woman whose calm obedience had unnerved him from the beginning, was systematically killing him. Each meal, each sip of drink, each act of domestic care was a measured, patient stroke in a larger design of annihilation. She was executing the same meticulous strategy that Philip and Henry had used to bankrupt him socially, financially, and morally. And confronting her would be futile. Her legal status as his wife, her apparent innocence, and her connection to the men who now controlled every aspect of his survival rendered accusation meaningless. A direct challenge would bring more immediate, violent repercussions orchestrated by those who had spent over a decade planning his ruin. In desperation, Aldrich began his own countermeasures. He secretly selected ingredients, cooked meals in isolation, and drank only water drawn from a private well that remained untouched by Celeste's hands. The marital bed became forbidden ground. He slept in a locked guest chamber, fortifying himself against her subtle interventions. These precautions offered temporary relief, yet they revealed his paranoia to anyone watching closely. Visiting neighbors noted his gaunt appearance, the nervous tick in his hands, the careful scrutiny with which he avoided any food she prepared. Rumors of mental instability spread, whispers that the unusual marriage had driven him into eccentricity or delusion. Celeste's brilliance lay in the artistry of her duplicity. To outsiders, she was the devoted, patient wife, tending to a husband stricken by stress or illness. She prepared meals he refused, offered drinks he declined, responded with tender concern to each apparent paranoia. Her calculated composure transformed Aldrich's defensive vigilance into an image of mental fragility. He was the delusional husband, the fearful man unraveling under his own imagined threats, while she appeared as the caring, innocent partner maintaining household harmony. Every act of caution he took, every avoidance of her carefully prepared dishes, served only to cement the illusion. Aldrich had been surrounded by ghosts before, Philip, Henry, and the memories of his murdered victims, but now he was haunted by a living spectre. Each day with Celeste was a precise, psychological hammer blow, a reminder that his life, once built on stolen wealth and blood-soaked ambition, was now meticulously dismantled. The poison coursed invisibly through him, a slow, inexorable force, turning every bite, every sip, every interaction into a silent instrument of retribution. And still, he had to maintain appearances, to perform the role of husband, while the very foundations of his existence decayed around him. In the shadowed halls of Willowbrook, Aldrich was learning the cruelest lesson of all: some punishments do not strike swiftly. They are methodical, they are invisible, they are intimate, weaving themselves into every corner of life until every morsel of comfort becomes a reminder of guilt, and every gesture of supposed normalcy carries the weight of inevitability. Celeste's calculated patience, her silent command of the house, and her subtle, deadly ministrations ensured that his decline was total, complete, and unstoppable, and in that oppressive stillness, gospel of the haunted whispers through the corridors of Willowbrook, vengeance is patient, precise, and merciless. It does not simply punish, it teaches, it corrodes, it transforms the ordinary into a mirror reflecting every crime, every act of cruelty, every betrayal. For Jeremiah Aldrich, the slow unraveling had begun. Every meal, every smile, every measured act from his wife was now a countdown to a death that would feel inevitable, natural, and utterly deserved. This was no ordinary punishment. It was the perfect fusion of intelligence, patience, and cruelty. And for Aldrich, there would be no escape, an inexorable collapse of the life he had once believed untouchable. Aldrich's paranoia had become his prison, a labyrinth of fear from which there was no escape. His meticulous precautions, the secret meals, the locked rooms, the constant vigilance, all of it was interpreted by the world as evidence of a mind unraveling. Friends, associates, even Dr. Warren, dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a man undone by financial ruin and social humiliation. How could anyone believe that a woman, once enslaved and bound to him by law, could orchestrate a death so subtle, so prolonged, so perfectly executed? The very idea seemed impossible, yet the truth was inescapable. By the late spring of 1854, Aldrich was living inside a nightmare of his own making, a nightmare his own clear eyes could see, yet no one else would recognize. Every meal, every gesture, every polite word from Celeste was a reminder of his helplessness, a cold proof of the life he had built on cruelty and theft unraveling before him. The poison, slow and deliberate, infiltrated him with invisible precision. At first, the discomfort was almost imperceptible. The nausea, the dizziness, the fatigue, dismissed as stress or exhaustion. But over weeks, the effects accumulated. The headaches sharpened, the digestive torments deepened, and the unrelenting weariness gnawed at his body and mind alike. He had been bound, not just by law, but by the invisible chains of a vengeance decades in the making. Dr. Warren's diagnosis confirmed what Aldrich feared most. Chronic poisoning, the physician said, voice low but unwavering. Arsenic or a comparable substance. Symptoms are consistent with prolonged, incremental administration. Without immediate removal from the source, the outcome is invariably fatal. The words fell like stones into Aldrich's chest. Celeste was killing him. Slowly, deliberately, with the same calculated patience that Philip and Henry had wielded to destroy his fortune, his social standing, his reputation. She was no mere instrument of revenge. She was its architect, hidden behind the veil of a dutiful wife. Confrontation was impossible. Any accusation would be met with denial, legal protection, and the assured intervention of the men orchestrating his downfall. Aldrich's attempts to shield himself were no more than temporary reprieves. Meals were prepared secretly, water sourced from hidden wells, beds slept in locked guest rooms, but the measures only amplified the appearance of instability to outsiders. Neighbors whispered of his gaunt frame, his suspicious glances, his refusal to partake in the simplest domestic rituals. To the world, Aldrich was unraveling, descending into madness. Celeste's mastery lay in the art of perception. She acted the devoted, caring wife, attending to a husband she was quietly killing. Meals were presented with grace, drinks offered with tenderness, gestures of concern displayed with theatrical patience. Any refusal, any sign of caution, appeared as paranoia, irrationality. The slow, invisible murder became a performance, transforming a man's intelligence and foresight into the outward evidence of insanity. By the time the 3-month anniversary of their marriage arrived, Aldrich was teetering on the edge of collapse. Celeste orchestrated a dinner party to commemorate the occasion, inviting the remaining neighbors, Dr. Warren, and other prominent members of society. Aldrich, predictably, prepared in secret, consuming his own food, avoiding any possible threat. But when Celeste produced a bottle of wine, claimed to have been aging since before their union, the ritual of its opening was meticulous. Poured in full view, inspected by all, ceremonially lifted in toast, it left Aldrich no choice. Refusal would brand him insane, unhinged, a spectacle of delusion to the observing crowd. As he raised the glass to his lips, Aldrich glimpsed the faintest slip in her expression, a shadow of cold triumph behind her mask of affection. Too late to retract, too late to resist, he drank. Within moments, the poison surged through him. Stomach cramps seized him, his chest burned, each breath a struggle, each pulse a signal of betrayal. He collapsed, gasping and clutching at himself, as the guests recoiled, convinced that this was merely the culmination of months of mental deterioration. Dr. Warren hurried to assist, but Celeste enacted her final layer of manipulation. She fell across Aldrich's trembling form, sobbing with heart-wrenching intensity, begging the doctor to save him, while simultaneously obstructing any effective intervention. The theater was perfect. Every observer's attention was on her grief, not his worsening condition. And as he lay gasping, on the edge between life and death, Celeste whispered into his ear with venomous precision, "Marcus Devo was my cousin. Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I have been working with Philip and Henry since 1845, waiting for this moment, waiting to see you die as you made them die slowly, painfully alone. The words struck deeper than any poison. The realization that his wife was no passive tool, but an active conspirator in the decades-long orchestration of his annihilation, was a horror beyond physical pain. Every meal he had eaten, every moment of false domesticity, had been a calculated instrument of torment, a prelude to the suffering now consuming him. His vision darkened, breath faltering, yet the performance continued. Celeste, flawless in her grief, pleaded with the doctor, invoked divine mercy, acted as though the collapse of her husband were tragedy itself. The guests, convinced, rallied around her, leaving Aldrich to suffer alone, the ultimate witness to his own downfall. It was the culmination of years, the apex of slow, deliberate vengeance. Philip and Henry's meticulous planning, Celeste's coldly precise execution, and the societal blindness of those around him combined to produce a punishment, both exquisite and unrelenting. Aldrich's body failed while his mind, now fully aware of the conspiracy, endured a psychological torment far beyond the physical. Every whisper, every smile, every act of obedience and civility had been a weapon aimed at him, a reminder that some retribution is patient, methodical, and intimate. Gospel of the haunted whispers through the darkened rooms of Willowbrook. Vengeance does not strike at once. It creeps. It infiltrates. It transforms every aspect of life into a reflection of every crime, every betrayal, every cruelty committed. For Jeremiah Aldrich, the lesson was complete. The slow, inevitable collapse of body, mind, and legacy, orchestrated with a precision only the most patient hatred can achieve, had begun. There would be no escape, no reprieve, only the relentless, exquisite horror of justice long delayed, finally arriving at last. Jeremiah Aldrich drew his last breath at precisely 9:47 p.m. On a humid June evening, the air heavy with the kind of oppressive stillness that seems to anticipate tragedy. Around him, neighbors murmured in sympathetic confusion, convinced that he had succumbed to a stroke, a heart attack, or some unseen consequence of months, perhaps years, of mounting stress and mental decline. Dr. Warren, his longtime physician, recorded the cause of death as natural, attributing the collapse to nervous exhaustion compounded by deteriorating health. The explanation satisfied everyone, every mind comfortably insulated by the veneer of propriety and social expectation. Every mind, that is, except those who truly understood the intricacies of his demise. Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle knew, with cold precision, exactly what had ended Aldrich's life and why. The funeral was a scene of the predictable and the performative. Celeste played her part with such seamless conviction that prominent ladies from neighboring plantations rushed to offer assistance in managing Willowbrook during her so-called mourning. Each word, each tear, each carefully measured gesture concealed the glee of a woman who had just completed the most meticulously executed act of vengeance in the annals of Louisiana history. No one suspected that the weeping widow at the graveside had orchestrated, for months, a slow, deliberate, perfect execution of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Yet Aldrich's death was only the beginning of the final act. Philip and Henry had anticipated every conceivable contingency. The disposition of his property, the future of his widow, and the appearance of legality that would shield them from suspicion. By law, Celeste inherited Willowbrook Plantation, along with every debt and obligation attached to it. But the debts were hers in name only. Philip and Henry, acting as representatives of the institutions that Aldrich had once manipulated for his own gain, swiftly reminded her that every financial claim was now under their control. Within weeks of the funeral, she had signed away the plantation in exchange for absolution from its burdens, disappearing northward with enough capital to forge a new life as a free woman, a life unencumbered by the past, untraceable and unremarked upon by those who had once enslaved her. The official record told one story. Jeremiah Aldrich had died of natural causes, and Willowbrook Plantation had changed hands in a routine transfer. To the Louisiana authorities, preoccupied with the mounting tensions that would soon erupt into civil war, there was nothing extraordinary to investigate. The tale of a plantation owner who had married his former slave, then died shortly thereafter, became a minor anecdote, occasionally cited as the eccentric folly of a man undone by financial strain. But beneath the surface, among a select few families in New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, a different account circulated quietly. It spoke of patience measured in decades, of vengeance executed with surgical precision, of a justice so perfect that it mirrored the cruelty Aldrich had inflicted upon others. Philip Deveau and Henry Rochelle had achieved the impossible within the rigid framework of antebellum society. They had executed a punishment no court would sanction, orchestrated a death no judge would approve, and done so without leaving a trace of culpability. They had studied the mechanisms of Louisiana's legal and social systems with unerring comprehension, manipulating laws, debts, and social expectation to create a reality in which their enemies' destruction seemed natural, inevitable, and unquestionable. The transformation of Willowbrook Plantation itself became the final testament to their ingenuity. Instead of selling the estate for profit, they converted it into a sanctuary for freed slaves and those escaping the bonds of bondage, a station on the Underground Railroad, guiding people northward toward freedom. The property Aldrich had once exploited to perpetuate human suffering now operated in direct contradiction to everything he had valued. The house that had hosted lavish entertainments for the elite became a beacon of liberation. And because Philip and Henry maintained legitimate, high-profile business personas, the unusual activities remained invisible to local authorities, concealed behind layers of respectability. Willowbrook became a weapon forged from the very tools Aldrich had used to oppress, a place of redemption built atop the ruins of his ambition. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this revenge was the erasure of Aldrich himself. Unlike victims of ordinary crimes, he left no legacy of influence, no descendants to carry his name, no monuments to commemorate wealth or status. His assets were redistributed to the families of those he had wronged, his property repurposed as instruments of justice. His reputation obliterated not through scandal, but by a combination of his own actions and the precise choreography of his enemies. To the wider world, Aldrich was merely a cautionary anecdote, a failed planter undone by gambling, eccentricity, and financial mismanagement. To those who understood, however, he was a case study in patient, intelligent retribution. This tale reminds us that justice is not always delivered in the courts. Sometimes it waits, slow and deliberate, hidden within the folds of society itself, beyond the reach of law, beyond the scrutiny of the powerful. Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle exemplified this truth, demonstrating that a crime meticulously calculated, measured against the perfect timeline of human patience, could be punished with a precision unmatched by any jury or judge. They had turned vengeance into art, and in doing so, they had not only punished Jeremiah Aldrich, they had rewritten his entire existence, replacing his legacy with one of liberation and justice, ensuring that the consequences of greed and cruelty were felt far beyond the limits of his mortal life. Gospel of the Haunted whispers through the shadows of Willowbrook, vengeance is patient. It is deliberate. It is relentless. And when it arrives, it does not merely punish, it transforms. It reshapes history, it redefines legacies. It ensures that every crime, every betrayal, every act of cruelty echoes through time, leaving its perpetrators as nothing more than ghosts of their former selves. Aldrich's story serves as a warning, a reminder, and a dark testament to the power of intelligence, patience, and moral reckoning. Justice, in its most subtle and exquisite form, is neither immediate nor public. It is quiet, it is hidden. It waits for the perfect moment, striking not with brute force, but with a calculated inevitability that leaves no escape, no redemption, no witness to the truth except those who truly understand the patience of the haunted.